The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., and she hit it with the same tired hand that had washed dishes until midnight. Another day, another double shift. She dragged herself out of bed, careful not to wake her mother sleeping in the next room. The apartment was small, barely big enough for 2 people, but it was all they could afford now. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many late nights and not enough sleep. Her hands were rough, not from playing beautiful music like they used to be, but from carrying heavy trays and scrubbing tables. Sometimes she'd catch herself moving her fingers in the air, practicing pieces she used to play, muscle memory refusing to forget what her life had forced her to leave behind. The bus ride to the Grandview Hotel took 40 minutes. She watched the city wake up through the foggy window. Business people rushing to their offices, students heading to universities she could no longer afford. She was 26 years old, and somewhere along the way all her dreams had been packed into boxes and shoved into the back of a closet. It hadn't always been like this. 3 years ago she'd been different. She'd walked with her head high. A full scholarship to the conservatory, a future so bright it hurt to look at directly. Her teachers said she had something special. That rare combination of technical skill and emotional depth that couldn't be taught. Her mother would sit in the audience at every recital, beaming with pride that her daughter was going to make it, really make it. Then her mother got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that drains bank accounts faster than it drains hope. Cancer doesn't care about scholarships or dreams or the fact that you're just starting to build something beautiful. The medical bills came in waves, each one bigger than the last. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. She remembered the day she realized she'd have to make a choice. The piano had been her grandmother's, passed down with love and careful hands. A Steinway, not the most expensive model, but beautiful and perfectly maintained. It had a tone that made even simple scales sound like poetry. She'd learned to play on that piano, spent thousands of hours coaxing music from its keys. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb. But her mother needed surgery. Her mother needed medication. Her mother needed to live. So she sold the piano and dropped out of school. She told her mother it was temporary, that she'd go back next semester. They both knew she was lying. But sometimes love means accepting the lies that make things bearable. The restaurant manager hired her because they were desperate for staff, not because they cared about her background. Her classical training meant nothing when you were carrying soup and remembering who ordered the steak medium rare. The other servers were nice enough, but they didn't understand why she sometimes stared at the grand piano in the corner of the dining room like it was a ghost. That piano mocked her every single day. It sat there perfectly tuned, barely used except for the occasional holiday party when they'd hire someone to play background music. Nobody really listened. It was just decoration, like the expensive paintings on the walls or the crystal chandeliers. She'd asked once if she could play during her break. Her manager laughed and said the piano was for professionals, not waitstaff. The irony burned. She'd performed in concert halls. She'd won competitions. She'd made audiences cry with her interpretation of Rachmaninoff. And now she couldn't even touch the piano in the restaurant where she served breadsticks. Her routine was brutal. Morning shift started at 7, running until 3. Then she'd go home, check on her mother, make sure she'd taken her medication, prepare dinner. By 6, she'd be back at the restaurant for the evening shift, serving wealthy people who spent more on a single meal than she made in a week. She'd get home around midnight, exhausted, her feet aching, her back screaming. Then she'd do it all again. The only thing that kept her sane was the keyboard in her apartment. Not a real piano, just a cheap electronic one she'd found at a thrift store. It didn't sound right, the keys felt wrong, but it was something. Late at night, with headphones on so she wouldn't wake her mother, she'd play. Her fingers remembered everything her life was trying to make her forget. Her mother was getting better slowly. The surgery had been successful. The medication was working, but the debt was crushing. Even working double shifts, she was barely keeping up with the payment plans. There were nights she'd sit at the kitchen table, looking at bills spread out like a terrible game of cards, trying to figure out which one she could delay paying without destroying her credit completely. The other servers talked about their lives, their plans, their dreams. One girl was saving up for college. Another guy was trying to start his own business. They asked her what she wanted to do with her life, and she'd smile and say something vague. How could she explain that she'd already had her chance and lost it? That she'd been somebody once, somebody with potential and promise, and now she was just another anonymous face serving food to people who didn't see her. The Grandview Hotel attracted a certain type of clientele. Rich, powerful, important. People who made decisions that affected thousands of lives while barely glancing up from their phones. She'd served senators, celebrities, business executives whose companies she'd never be able to afford to buy from. They were polite enough, mostly. They tipped reasonably, but they looked through her, not at her. Sometimes she'd hear them talking about the arts, about the symphony they'd attended, the opera they'd sponsored, the young talent they were so excited to support. She'd stand there refilling their water glasses, invisible, knowing that she'd been that young talent once, knowing that if circumstances had been different, she might have been the one they were discussing over their expensive wine. But circumstances weren't different. This was her life now. Wake up, work, take care of her mother, sleep, repeat. The dreams she'd had felt like they belonged to a different person, someone naive enough to believe that talent and hard work were enough. Life had taught her differently. Life had taught her that sometimes love means sacrifice, and sacrifice means giving up the things that make you who you are. Still, late at night with her headphones on and her fingers on those cheap plastic keys, she could close her eyes and remember what it felt like to make real music. Remember the feeling of an audience holding its breath, hanging on every note. Remember being someone who mattered, even if just for the length of a song. She didn't know that everything was about to change. That one night, one performance, one moment of pure honesty would crack her life wide open. She just knew she was tired, her feet hurt, and she had another double shift to get through. The evening started like any other Thursday night. She was assigned to the private dining room, which usually meant better tips but also meant dealing with people who had very specific demands. Her manager pulled her aside before service and gave her the speech he always gave when important guests were coming. Be attentive but invisible. Smile but don't talk unless spoken to. Make sure everything is perfect. The reservation was for 8 people. A business dinner, her manager explained, with someone very important. He didn't say who, but the way he was sweating and checking his watch every 30 seconds told her everything she needed to know. This was the kind of guest who could make or break the restaurant with a single review. They arrived at 7 sharp. She recognized him immediately, though she'd only seen him in news articles and business magazines. One of those billionaires who seemed to own half the internet. The kind of person who could buy the entire restaurant without checking his bank account. He was older, maybe late 50s, with sharp eyes that looked like they were constantly calculating something. His guests were similar. Expensive suits, designer watches that cost more than her yearly salary. The kind of confident posture that comes from never having to worry about money. They talked in that casual way rich people do about millions of dollars, like normal people discuss groceries. She brought water, took drink orders, and tried to be invisible like her manager instructed. But he noticed her. She felt his eyes following her as she moved around the table. It made her uncomfortable, but she kept her professional smile in place. Maybe he was just the type who paid attention to details. Rich people could be weird about service. The background music playing was the usual generic piano compilation. The kind of soulless stuff that was designed to be heard but not listened to. She caught him grimacing at it, then looking over at the grand piano sitting unused in the corner. Her stomach dropped. She knew that look. He was getting an idea, and she had a feeling she wasn't going to like it. Halfway through the appetizer course, he called her over. His voice was the kind that was used to being obeyed without question. He asked her name, which she gave quietly. Then he pointed at her employee badge, the one that stupidly listed interests as part of the hotel's new initiative to make staff seem more personable. Under hers, it said classical piano. You play? He asked. It wasn't really a question. It was an assessment. She nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. I studied it, yes. Studied where? She named the conservatory. His eyebrows raised slightly. One of his guests, a woman with diamond earrings that could pay off all her debt, actually looked up from her phone for the first time. Interesting, he said, and that single word made her more nervous than any complaint about cold soup ever had. The music they're playing is terrible. Go play something on that piano. It wasn't a request. The way he said it made that clear. She glanced toward the kitchen, hoping her manager might somehow rescue her from this situation, but he was nodding enthusiastically from the doorway. Of course he was. Whatever the billionaire wanted, the billionaire got. I'm working right now, she said carefully, trying to find a polite way to refuse. I'm aware. I'm asking you to work differently for the next few minutes. Unless you can't actually play? The challenge in his voice was obvious. So was the threat underneath it. One of his guests laughed. This should be interesting. I bet she's about as good as the hotel's wine selection. The others chuckled. They were treating her like entertainment, like a performing monkey brought in to amuse them between courses. Her manager appeared at her elbow, practically pushing her toward the piano. Of course she can play for you. We're happy to accommodate any request. His smile was desperate. She understood. If she refused and this man got angry, her manager's job was at risk. Which meant her job was at risk. Which meant her mother's medical bills wouldn't get paid. She walked to the piano on shaking legs. Behind her, she heard one of the guests make a joke about this being better than the usual boring business dinners. Another said something about hoping she was better at piano than at refilling water glasses, because his had been empty for 5 minutes. They all laughed. She wasn't a person to them. She was just a momentary distraction. Her hands hovered over the keys. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd played a real piano in front of people. 3 years since she'd felt this particular brand of terror mixed with longing. The instrument was beautiful, perfectly maintained, the kind of piano she used to take for granted and now dreamed about. The billionaire called out again. Make it good. If you're actually as trained as your badge says, this should be easy. Then to his companions, he added something that made her blood run cold. Let's make this interesting. If she's good, genuinely good, I'll tip accordingly. If she's just another person who took a few lessons and calls themselves a musician, she can serve us the rest of the night for free. What do you think? His guests loved it. They were already pulling out their phones, probably to record her failure. One man suggested making it even more interesting by having her play something specific, something difficult. They were debating which impossible piece to demand when the billionaire held up his hand. No. Let her choose. A real musician should be able to select something appropriate. He looked directly at her. Impress us. Or don't. Either way, I'm curious to see if that conservatory education was worth anything. The cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't really interested in the music. This was a game to him, a way to show his guests how easily he could control people, how even someone's training and dignity could become entertainment if you had enough money. If she played badly, she'd be humiliated and lose money she desperately needed. If she played well, she'd be proving that she belonged here, serving them, rather than performing in the places she used to dream about. Her manager was still hovering nearby, his expression begging her to just do whatever the billionaire wanted. The kitchen staff had started peering through the door, curious about what was happening. The whole restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. She looked at the piano, then at her hands, rough from work but still remembering every chord, every scale, every piece she'd ever loved. She thought about her mother at home waiting for her, depending on her. She thought about the debt that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours she worked. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who'd believed that music mattered more than money. That girl was gone, but maybe, just for a few minutes, she could pretend to be her again. She took a breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. Her fingers touched the keys and everything else disappeared. The restaurant, the cruel billionaire, the guests with their phones ready to record her failure. All of it faded into background noise as the piano responded to her touch like an old friend welcoming her home. She started with Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat major. It was safe, beautiful, the kind of piece that even people who knew nothing about classical music could appreciate. Her muscle memory took over, carrying her through the opening phrases. Technically perfect, exactly as she'd been taught. Her professors would have been proud. But something felt wrong. She was playing it too carefully, too safely, like she was afraid to break something. These people expected a trained monkey performing tricks. They wanted technical precision, proof that the conservatory badge on her uniform wasn't a lie. And she was giving them exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. Halfway through the nocturne, something inside her cracked. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working double shifts for 3 years. Maybe it was the humiliation of being turned into entertainment for people who saw her as less than human. Maybe it was just that she was tired of being afraid, tired of playing it safe, tired of pretending that losing everything hadn't broken something fundamental inside her. Her hands shifted on the keys. The Chopin melody was still there, but she started weaving something else into it. Something that wasn't written in any sheet music. Her own voice, her own story. bleeding through the classical structure. The song began to change, transforming into something that existed somewhere between what she'd learned and what she'd lived. She thought about her mother, about watching her get weaker, watching the light fade from her eyes as the cancer spread, about the helplessness of being 23 years old and unable to fix the one person who'd always fixed everything for you. The music turned darker, minor chords speaking the grief she'd never had time to properly feel. She thought about selling the piano, about watching strangers load her grandmother's Steinway onto a truck, taking with it every memory of learning to play, every recital, every moment of joy that instrument had given 3 generations of women in her family. The melody fractured, notes stumbling over each other like her heart had stumbled that day. She thought about dropping out of school, about her professors' disappointed faces when she'd explained she couldn't come back, about the scholarship letter that had promised her a future, now just paper in a drawer somewhere. The music swelled with anger, her left hand pounding out a rhythm that felt like fists against an unfair world. Behind her, the conversation had stopped. She didn't notice. She was too far gone, too deep into the story her hands were telling. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, years of suppressed emotion finding release through the keys. This wasn't performance anymore. This was confession. One of the kitchen staff had come to the door to listen. Then another. The bartender stopped making drinks. A couple at a nearby table turned their chairs to watch, but she didn't see any of it. Her eyes were closed now, tears streaming down her face, her whole body swaying with the music. The melody shifted again, finding something unexpected: hope. Small at first, just a few notes climbing upward against the darkness. She thought about her mother's text messages. Feeling better today. The doctor says the numbers look good. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Tiny lights in the overwhelming dark. She thought about the cheap keyboard in her apartment, how it sounded terrible and the keys stuck, but how she played it anyway. Every night, even when she was exhausted, even when her hands hurt, even when it seemed pointless. Because giving up the piano completely would mean giving up the last piece of who she used to be. The music grew stronger. Not happy exactly, but defiant. Surviving wasn't the same as living, but it was something. Keeping going when everything said to stop was its own kind of victory. Her right hand found a melody that felt like determination, like waking up every morning and deciding to try again even when trying hurt. The billionaire sat frozen in his chair, his water glass halfway to his lips forgotten. His expression had changed completely. He wasn't calculating anymore. He wasn't playing games. Something in the music had reached past his money and his power and his carefully constructed walls, and touched something human underneath. Something he'd maybe forgotten was there. The woman with the diamond earrings had put her phone down. She was crying, mascara running, not even trying to hide it. One of the men had his hand over his mouth, staring at the piano like he'd never seen one before. They'd come here for a boring business dinner, and instead they were witnessing something raw and real and completely unexpected. The music built towards something bigger. All the pain, all the loss, all the struggle was gathering itself into a final statement. This is what it cost, her hands seemed to say. This is what survival looks like. This is what it means to keep going when everything is taken from you. This is what strength actually is, not the fake kind that comes from money and power, but the real kind that comes from losing everything and still showing up the next day. The crescendo hit like a wave crashing. Every emotion she'd been holding for 3 years, channeled through her hands into the piano. The sound filled the entire restaurant, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. CIT demanded to be heard, demanded to be felt, demanded that everyone in that room acknowledge the humanity they'd been so carefully ignoring. Then, slowly, carefully, she brought it back down. The anger softened. The pain eased. The music settled into something quieter, something that felt like acceptance, not giving up but letting go, finding peace with scars, learning to carry weight without letting it crush you. The final notes hung in the air like a question, like she was asking everyone listening, do you see me now? Do you understand that I'm not just a waitress, not just someone to bring you bread and water, that I'm a person with a story, with dreams that got deferred but not destroyed, that every person serving you, cleaning up after you, making your life comfortable is carrying their own weight you can't see? She lifted her hands from the keys, opened her eyes, came back to herself. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped in respect for what had just happened. She turned slowly on the piano bench, suddenly aware of what she'd done. She'd lost herself completely. She'd broken down in front of strangers. She'd probably just gotten herself fired for making a scene. She looked at the billionaire, expecting anger or disgust or that calculating expression back in place. Instead, she saw something she never expected to see in his eyes: recognition, understanding, and something that might have been shame. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound broke the spell. Then he started clapping. Just him alone, his applause echoing in the silent room. One of his guests joined in. Then another. Then the whole table was standing, applauding, and suddenly the entire restaurant was on its feet. The kitchen staff, the bartender, the other diners, everyone. She sat there, trembling, tears still wet on her face, unable to process what was happening. Unable to understand that she'd just done the thing she'd been afraid to do for 3 years. She'd let herself be seen. Really seen. And instead of destroying her, it had changed everything. The applause seemed to go on forever. She sat frozen at the piano bench, her hands still shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to play something nice, get through the humiliation and go back to serving dinner. Instead, she'd fallen apart in front of everyone, and somehow that had turned into a standing ovation. Her manager looked like he might faint from relief or confusion. She couldn't tell which. The other servers were staring at her like she'd grown a second head. She caught glimpses of people at other tables wiping their eyes, looking at her with something that might have been respect. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life instead of living her own. The billionaire was still standing, still clapping. When the applause finally died down, he didn't sit. Instead, he walked toward the piano, toward her. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She just sat there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting to see what happened next. Up close, his face looked different than it had before, softer somehow, older. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there during dinner, something that looked almost like pain. He stopped a few feet away from her, and for a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked at her, the way nobody in this restaurant had looked at her in 3 years. "Where did you learn to play like that?" His voice was quiet now, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used earlier. She swallowed hard. "The conservatory. The one on my badge. I had a scholarship before." She trailed off. She didn't owe him her story. He'd already taken enough from her tonight. "Before what?" He asked it gently, but she could hear the genuine curiosity underneath. Maybe it was because she'd already exposed everything else. Maybe it was because she was too exhausted to keep up walls anymore. Maybe it was because some part of her was angry and wanted him to know exactly what his cruel little game had cost her. Whatever the reason, she told him. About her mother. About the cancer. About selling her grandmother's piano to pay for treatment. About dropping out of school to work double shifts. About 3 years of watching her dreams fade while she served people who didn't see her as human. He listened without interrupting. His guests had sat back down, but they were listening too, their expensive dinners forgotten. The woman with the diamond earrings had fresh tears running down her face. One of the men looked genuinely uncomfortable, like he was realizing for the first time that the servers around him had actual lives, actual struggles, actual stories. When she finished, the silence stretched out again. She expected him to offer some polite sympathy and go back to his dinner. Rich people were good at sympathy. It cost them nothing and made them feel better about themselves. She'd heard plenty of "that's so sad" and "you're so strong" from customers who then left her a 10% tip, but he didn't do that. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started typing. She watched, confused, as he made a call right there in the middle of the restaurant. He walked a few steps away, but she could still hear him. He was talking to someone about the conservatory, about scholarships, about immediate enrollment. Her heart started pounding. This couldn't be what it sounded like. He came back and asked her questions. Practical ones. What year had she been in when she left? What was her concentration? Who had been her advisor? She answered automatically, still not understanding what was happening. This felt like a dream, the kind where you get everything you want and then wake up and it hurts worse than before. Then he said something that made her brain stop working entirely. "I'm going to pay for you to go back. Full tuition, all expenses, plus a salary so you don't have to work while you study, and another salary to cover your mother's medical care and living expenses. She stared at him. The words didn't make sense. People didn't just do things like that, especially not billionaires who 5 minutes ago had been treating her like a trained animal performing for scraps. Why? It was all she could manage to say. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Regret, maybe, or memory. My mother played piano. When I was young, before everything else, she had that same gift you have, that ability to make people feel things they didn't want to feel. She gave it up when she married my father. He didn't think it was appropriate for his wife to perform. By the time I was old enough to understand what she'd sacrificed, it was too late. She'd forgotten how to play like that. The technical skill was still there, but the heart of it was gone. She died 20 years ago, and I've spent all that time telling myself it didn't matter, that her choice was practical, that music is just a hobby anyway. He looked at the piano, then back at her. Tonight, listening to you play, I heard what she might have sounded like if she'd been allowed to keep going. And I realized I've become my father, making people small so I can feel big, treating art like it's worthless unless it makes money. I can't bring my mother back. I can't give her the life she should have had. But maybe I can stop someone else's mother from watching her daughter give up everything. The words hit her like a physical force. This wasn't charity. This wasn't some rich person's guilt talking. This was something deeper, something personal. She didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed impossibly small for what he was offering. One of his guests, the uncomfortable-looking man, suddenly spoke up. I want in. Whatever this costs, add my name to it. Match my contribution to hers. He looked at her directly for the first time all evening. My sister was an artist, painter. She gave it up to take care of our parents. She's 50 now, working retail, and I've never once helped her. Let me help you instead. The woman with the diamonds nodded, mascara-stained and determined. Me too, and not just money. I sit on the board at the symphony. We have a young artist program. You should be in it. Another guest pulled out her phone. I run a foundation that supports arts education. We need to talk. It was happening so fast. 5 minutes ago, these people had been laughing at her, ready to watch her fail for their entertainment. Now they were competing to help her, each one trying to outdo the others. The billionaire was making more calls, talking about setting up a foundation, something bigger than just helping her, something that could help other artists in the same situation. She sat at the piano, overwhelmed, trying to process everything. This morning she'd woken up as a waitress with nothing but debt and fading dreams. Now people were talking about paying for her education, supporting her career, changing her entire life. It felt impossible. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Her manager approached carefully, looking stunned. You can take the rest of the night off, he said quietly. I think you've earned it. She laughed, and it came out half sob. Earned it. She'd been earning it for 3 years. One double shift at a time, and nobody had noticed. It took breaking down in front of a room full of strangers for anyone to see that she was more than just a pair of hands carrying plates. The billionaire was back, phone finally away. I know this is a lot. Take some time to think about it. But I'm serious about the offer. All of it. He held out a business card. Call me tomorrow. We'll work out the details. She took the card with trembling fingers. It was heavy, expensive paper. The kind of thing she'd never expected to have in her hands. His name was printed in simple letters, along with a phone number and email. Proof that this was real, that it wasn't just words disappearing into air. I don't understand, she said finally. Why me? You could help anyone. You could fund 100 scholarships. He smiled, and it was sad and genuine, because you reminded me what music is supposed to be. Not background noise for rich people's dinners. Not something safe and comfortable. Real music, the kind that costs something. The kind my mother used to play before the world convinced her it wasn't valuable. You're right, I could help 100 people. And maybe I will. But tonight I heard you. Really heard you. That's worth something. She looked down at the card in her hand, then at the piano, then at all these people whose lives would never be the same as hers, but who were, for this one moment, actually seeing her as human, as valuable, as worth investing in. She thought about her mother at home, probably asleep by now, unaware that everything had just changed. She thought about the cheap keyboard in her apartment that she wouldn't need anymore. She thought about concert halls and conservatories and all the dreams she'd carefully packed away, convinced they were gone forever. Maybe they weren't gone. Maybe they were just waiting. 3 months later, she stood backstage at Carnegie Hall and her hands were shaking just like they had that night at the restaurant. But this time it was different. This time she was wearing a concert dress instead of a uniform. This time, people had paid to hear her play instead of watching her fail for entertainment. This time, her mother was sitting in the front row, her mother, healthy, smiling, wearing a new dress that didn't come from a thrift store. The medical bills were paid. All of them. The experimental treatment that insurance had refused to cover, covered. The follow-up care, covered. The anxiety that had lived in both their chests for 3 years, the constant fear that the cancer would come back and they wouldn't be able to afford to fight it, gone. She peeked through the curtain at the audience filling the hall. It wasn't sold out. This was a small recital series for emerging artists. But there were maybe 300 people out there. 300 people who'd chosen to spend their evening listening to her play. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The billionaire was there too, though she'd had to search the back rows to find him. He'd insisted on sitting in the back, said he didn't want to make a fuss, that this was her night, not his. She'd tried to argue, but quickly learned that he was just as stubborn about staying out of the spotlight as he'd once been about commanding it. In the 3 months since that night, he'd become something unexpected. Not quite a friend. The gap between their worlds was still too wide for that, but something more than a benefactor. A mentor, maybe. Someone who checked in, who asked how her studies were going, who actually listened to the answers. The foundation had happened fast, faster than she'd thought possible. But apparently when you had that kind of money, things moved at whatever speed you wanted. The Arts Opportunity Foundation, they called it. Dedicated to helping artists who'd been forced to give up their dreams for practical reasons. Medical bills, family obligations, economic hardship. All the things that crushed talent before it had a chance to bloom. She was the first recipient, but not the last. In 3 months, they'd already helped 12 other artists. A dancer who'd been driving trucks to support his kids. A sculptor who'd been working construction. A writer who'd been doing overnight shifts at a warehouse. Each one with a story like hers. Each one who'd been invisible until somebody finally looked. The program officer position had gone to the woman with the diamond earrings. Turned out she'd been looking for something meaningful to do with her life. Something more than just attending charity galas and writing checks. She'd thrown herself into the foundation with an intensity that surprised everyone, especially herself. She told the waitress during one of their planning meetings that hearing that performance had cracked something open inside her. Made her realize she'd been sleepwalking through her own life. Going back to the conservatory had been strange. Her old professors welcomed her back like she'd never left. But she felt different now. She'd learned things in those 3 years that couldn't be taught in a classroom. About resilience, about what really mattered. About the distance between dreaming and doing. Her playing had changed too. It was technically better than before. All those late nights on the cheap keyboard had kept her skills sharp. But more than that, it had depth now. Weight. Her teacher said she played like someone who'd lived, not just studied. The other students were younger than her, most of them fresh out of high school, still believing the world would hand them success if they just practiced hard enough. She didn't tell them any different. Let them keep their innocence a little longer. But she made friends with the older students, the ones who'd taken gap years or come back after trying other careers first. They understood each other in ways the younger ones couldn't. The piece she'd played that night at the restaurant, the improvisation that had started as Chopin and become something entirely her own. She'd spent months refining it, writing it down, developing it, turning a moment of raw emotion into an actual composition. Her teacher had encouraged her to include it in tonight's recital. "It's your story," he'd said. "Own it." So tonight's program was half classical repertoire and half her own work. Pieces she'd written over the past 3 months, each one exploring a different aspect of her journey. Loss, survival, hope, gratitude. The final piece was the one from that night, which she'd titled The Grandview Suite, after the restaurant where everything changed. It felt right somehow to honor the place where she'd been most broken and most seen. Her mother had cried when she'd played it for her the first time. Real crying, the kind that came from deep in the chest. Afterwards, she'd held her daughter tight and said, "I'm sorry you had to give up so much for me." And the daughter had held her back and said, "I'd do it again, but I'm glad I don't have to." Backstage, someone called 5 minutes to curtain. She took a deep breath and looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The woman looking back at her was familiar but different. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost from stress and 2 long shifts. Her hands were softer now, the calluses from carrying trays fading, but her eyes were older, wiser. She'd never be that naive girl who thought talent was enough. But maybe that was okay. Maybe being broken and put back together made you stronger than never being broken at all. The stage manager gave her the signal. It was time. She walked to the wings, waited for her introduction. The announcer talked about her background, the scholarship, the time away, the return. He mentioned the foundation, though she'd asked him to keep it brief. This night wasn't about charity or feel-good stories. It was about the music. She walked onto the stage and the applause washed over her. She found her mother in the front row, beaming with pride and health and hope. She found the billionaire in the back, nodding at her with something that might have been approval. She saw the other foundation recipients scattered through the audience, the dancer and the sculptor and the writer, all of them supporting each other now. But mostly, she looked at the piano. A beautiful Steinway, perfectly tuned, waiting for her. Not her grandmother's piano, that was gone forever. But this one was hers in a different way, earned through survival, through refusing to let go completely, through one moment of absolute honesty that had changed everything. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. The audience quieted. In the silence before the first note, she thought about the cheap keyboard in her apartment. She hadn't gotten rid of it. It sat in the corner now, a reminder of where she'd been, some nights when the conservatory felt too easy. When she needed to remember why any of this mattered, she'd play it instead of the school's practice pianos. Just to keep herself honest, she began with Bach, the Goldberg Variations aria and first variation. Her fingers found the notes easily, muscle memory and years of training carrying her through. But she wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story about falling and getting back up, about losing everything and finding out you still have yourself, about the people who see you when you're invisible, and the moment when invisibility becomes impossible. The music filled the hall, and this time, she wasn't crying. This time she was smiling, because this was hers now, not stolen moments on a cheap keyboard, not playing for cruel entertainment. This was real. Her life, her music, her choice. After the recital, there would be a reception. People would tell her she was talented, that she had a bright future. Her mother would introduce her to everyone like she'd won an Olympic medal. The billionaire would probably disappear without saying goodbye because he was awkward about emotions. The foundation people would want to take pictures for their website. But right now there was just this, her and the piano and the music and 300 people listening, really listening. The way she'd always dreamed they would, she'd